Just a day before James Comey's much anticipated testimony, the heads of 2 US intelligence agencies all throughout the day have been grilled by the Senate Intelligence Committee. And we've learned a little bit, but there's also a lot that those individuals have not been willing to say. We've got many instances of this. We do want to show you some of them. So you're gonna see some of the frustration immediately on the face of some of these senators, for the most part Democrats, but Marco Rubio also attempted in ways to get some real answers. So the fundamental question is, did Donald Trump intervene in some fashion to try to either stop Comey or the investigation into Russia and the election more generally? And so here is the beginning of that.
Director Coates, you've said as well that it would be inappropriate to answer a simple question about whether the president asked for your assistance in blunting the Russia investigation. I don't care how you felt. I'm not asking whether you felt pressured. I'm simply asking, did that conversation occur?
And once again, Senator, I will say that I do believe it's inappropriate for me to discuss that in an open session.
You realize, and obviously this is not releasing any classified information, but you realize how simple it would simply be to say, no, that never happened.
And so he's gonna continue trying to get this guy to go on the record. You're gonna see that in this clip.
Why is it inappropriate, Director Coates?
I think conversations between the president and myself are, for the most part.
You seem to apply that standard selectively.
No, I'm not applying it selectively. I'm just saying I don't think it's appropriate.
You can clear an awful lot up by simply saying that never happened.
I do not share with the general public conversations that I have with the president or many of my colleagues within the administration that I believe should not be shared.
Well, I think your unwillingness to answer a very basic question speaks volumes.
It's not a matter of unwillingness,
Mr. Rosen. It is a matter of unwillingness.
It's a matter of how I share it and whom I share it to. And when there are ongoing investigations, I think it's inappropriate to.
So you don't think the American people deserve to know the answer to that question?
I think the investigations will determine that.
I mean, that hearing is part of the investigation, one would think. And yeah, general public, I get that means something. It is a group of senators who are trying to find out. I mean, oversight is so difficult with this White House. We have a White House lawyer saying, as a matter of policy, do not cooperate with any Democratic senatorial or congressional attempts at oversight, requisitions of information and things like that. And so a little bit of help would be nice from the DNI and other intelligence heads.
I wonder if he's trying to play it in a way where if he doesn't confirm it, he won't deal with any type of retaliation from the Trump administration. But if he denies it, I mean, he's lying, so he could face ramifications for that should the investigation find that Trump was trying to, meddle with the investigation and was guilty of obstruction of justice. I don't know if it was a smart strategy, but either way, it seems like you're hiding something, dude. And that doesn't look good.
Absolutely, and I think if there is fear of retaliation from the White House, then that also should be a public concern, right? That folks can't speak out and tell the truth for fear of retaliation from our White House. And I also think him saying that he doesn't want to share something with the general public, well, you kind of answer to the general public, right? Like you answer to us. So
exactly.
If that was the case, then this shouldn't be public. It's kind of like, why are you here?
Whenever you, did X conversation happen? Well, I can't really say if it did or not. You're confirmed, that is confirming it, because if it didn't, like imagine if he didn't have that conversation with Trump, and he's saying, I can't confirm or deny. Trump would be at home like, what are you talking about? You can't, it didn't happen, deny that it happened. So clearly this is an admission that those sorts of conversations did happen. And when you combine that with a million other responses during these hearings, where they keep saying, I didn't feel pressured. Okay, forget the pressure, did it happen? I can't confirm or deny. That's a strategy that they have come up with where we will just say we didn't feel pressured. It may have happened, it may have been unethical or illegal, but I didn't personally feel pressured. I like pressure situations. Then they're admitting what actually happened there. I mentioned during our production meeting, I forget her name, but it was, I believe it was a female Democratic senator. said, did the White House give you any instruction on how to answer our questions? And was there a discussion of using executive privilege? And down the line, the 4 men said there was no discussion of executive privilege. 1, 2, 3, 4, sidestepping the first conversation, which is, were you coached on how to answer these questions? And clearly they have been. I do want to play a little bit more. In this next clip, you're going to have Angus King on a similar line of questioning.
Did you know when you wrote the memo that was used as the primary justification for firing Director Comey that the administration would be using it as the primary justification?
Senator, as I know you're aware, I have there are a number of documents associated with me that are in the public record. The memorandum I wrote concerning Director Comey is in the public record. The order appointing the special counsel is in the public record. The press release I issued accompanying that order is in the public record, and a written version of the statement that I delivered to.
Were you aware that it would be the primary justification for his firing?
Pardon me, Senator, 100 United States senators and 435 congressmen is in the public record. I answered many questions in the closed briefings of the 100 senators.
But you're not answering this question.
And as I explained in those briefings, Senator, I support Mr. McCabe on this. We have a special counsel who is investigating, now responsible for the Russian.
At this point, you filibuster better than most of my colleagues, so I'm going to move on to another question.
He does filibuster very well, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in hour 2.
I know that there are some people that still don't believe that there's anything there, and they will go to the end of days thinking that there's nothing there. But just think, okay, you have 2 possible worlds. Something is there to be discovered, something happened, or it didn't. The behavior that we've seen over the past 4 months does not make any sense if there's nothing there to be found. Trump and his cronies would not be going to these incredible, possibly illegal lengths to shut down and control this investigation if they could simply let it proceed and then nothing would come of it. But in particular, you might say, your response might be, okay, they're just worried that even if there's nothing there, the investigation existing will be a distraction. And that would be a fine counterpoint, except that their attempts to control the messaging and the narrative is the distraction. That is what's distracting from his agenda if it exists. And they had to have caught on to that by now. So clearly their behavior has some other explanation. The simplest one is that they're trying to avoid something being discovered.
Right, and for those who think this is just a huge distraction or this is something that establishment Democrats have latched onto because they don't want to talk about policy. If you want to criticize Democrats for not talking about policy enough and focusing too much on Russia, I think that's a fair criticism. But I think it's also incredibly irresponsible and misguided to just pretend like Russia, like beyond a shadow of a doubt that Russia is not an issue. Let's not focus on it at all, even though there has been a slow and steady drip of some evidence, some indication that Russia did meddle in our elections, that there is obstruction of justice just based on Trump's very transparent behavior. Like, it's something that does need to be investigated. And it's just really interesting to me that especially liberals who are in favor of evidence, who want investigations, who want to make sure that things are kind of hashed out and put to rest before we move on. It's interesting that they want to move away from this and not focus on it at all. You can do, as Maxine Waters said, you can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Exactly,
right?
yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah, I mean, we got these 24-hour a day news networks. We produce a lot of videos here. I think that we can cover both.
Exactly.
Yeah, and look, what we're talking about here is obstruction of justice, and I've got a little bit more on that right now. The interesting thing about obstruction of justice is that it's illegal, and it's illegal whether they could find anything in this investigation or not. Even if there was nothing, he's free and clear. He cannot obstruct the FBI from conducting these investigations. And there are some people who would be willing to simply lay down, to provide no check on the illegal behavior of the president, simply because they're worried about some of the implications if it's found out. And that is frustrating. I wish that we could have some sort of united front on checking this president's excesses of power. But I do want to talk about the obstruction of justice, because you saw there, Coates was testifying. Coates came up in something that was revealed yesterday, actually. This was being reported, I believe, by the Washington Post originally. Apparently, and this is coming from sources inside the administration, after a White House briefing on March 22nd, 2 days after Comey publicly confirmed the investigation into Trump's team in Russia, Trump requested that everyone present leave the room except Coates and CIA Director Mike Pompeo, just as he reportedly did before he asked Comey to drop the Flynn investigation. Then, according to this source, Trump started complaining about the FBI investigation and Comey's handling of it. He then asked Coates, quote, if he could intervene with Comey to get the Bureau to back off its focus on former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn in its Russia probe. So there, he's talking to the Director of National Intelligence and seeing if maybe something could be done to shut down an FBI investigation of one of his associates. Again, you can't do that, that's not allowed. And clearly Trump knew that it's not allowed, that's why he cleared the room before requesting it.
But John, the obstruction of justice or potential obstruction of justice is not the big story here. The big story is there are unnamed sources that are talking to the media and we need to figure out who they are.
Need to be shut down, yes.
Young Turks membership creates independent media.
Believe me.
No ads.
Believe me.
All the shows.
Believe me.
On demand.
Believe me.
Support independent media.
Believe me.
It's awesome, tremendous, you'll love it.
Believe me.
And by the end, you'll be thinking,
you know, I'm like a smart person.
tytnetwork.com/join.